Hi, I'm Natalie, and 3 months ago my sister Vanessa destroyed the most important day of my pregnancy by pulling a fire alarm during our gender reveal party. What she didn't know was that her little stunt would lead me down a rabbit hole that would expose the biggest lie her marriage was built on. Sometimes revenge comes in the form of truth, and sometimes the truth is more shocking than anyone could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 15th started like any other Saturday in Portland, with that gentle drizzle that makes everything smell like pine and possibility. I was standing in my Hawthorne District apartment, smoothing down the soft yellow dress I'd chosen specifically because it was neutral. Derek was in the kitchen making his famous blueberry pancakes, humming off-key to some indie band I'd never heard of. Everything felt perfect, like those moments you want to bottle up and save for when life gets complicated. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. A text from Vanessa. Running late but wouldn't miss this for the world. Can't wait to find out if I'm getting a niece or nephew. The message came with 3 heart emojis and a baby bottle icon. I smiled, feeling that warm flutter in my chest that came whenever my big sister showed genuine excitement about my life. Vanessa and I had always been different. She was the spontaneous one, the one who dyed her hair purple in high school and convinced our parents to let her backpack through Europe after graduation. I was the planner, the one with color-coded calendars and backup plans for my backup plans. But despite our differences, or maybe because of them, we'd always been close. She was my maid of honor when Derek and I got married 2 years ago, and I was hers when she married Cameron just 8 months later. The gender reveal party had been Derek's idea, actually. I had initially wanted something small. Maybe just telling our parents over dinner at that little Italian place in Lake Oswego, where we always celebrated family milestones. But Derek had convinced me that this baby deserved a celebration, that after 2 years of trying and 1 devastating miscarriage the year before, we should embrace this joy loudly and proudly. So here we were, about to head to Laurelhurst Park, where 30 of our closest friends and family members would gather around as we cut into a cake that would reveal either pink or blue inside. The baker, a sweet woman named Chloe who ran a small shop in Selwood, had been the only person besides Derek and me to know the secret. Well, and Dr. Martinez, my OB/GYN, but she was bound by medical confidentiality. I ran my hands over my barely there bump, still amazed that there was a tiny human growing inside me. 18 weeks along, and I was just starting to feel those flutter kicks that reminded me this was real. The morning sickness had finally subsided, replaced by an energy I hadn't felt in months. Everything was falling into place. Derek appeared in the doorway, flour dusting his dark hair, and that crooked smile that had made me fall in love with him during our college photography class. "You ready for this, Mama?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder. "I think so," I said, leaning back into his warmth. "It's just a cake cutting, right? How complicated can it be?" Famous last words. We arrived at Laurelhurst Park an hour early to set up. The covered pavilion we'd reserved overlooked the duck pond, and despite the October chill, the setting was perfect. Derek strung up the white and yellow streamers while I arranged the gift table and set out the coffee urns we'd rented. My mom, Linda, arrived shortly after with my dad, Robert, in tow. She immediately took over the food setup with the efficiency of someone who'd been organizing family gatherings for 35 years. "Where's Vanessa?" Mom asked, checking her watch. "She said she'd be here early to help with decorations." I shrugged, trying not to let the familiar pang of disappointment show. Vanessa's relationship with punctuality had always been complicated. You know her. She'll show up with some elaborate apology and a story that makes us all forget we were ever annoyed. And that's exactly what happened. Vanessa swept in 40 minutes later wearing a flowing emerald dress that somehow managed to look both casual and elegant, her auburn hair pinned up in an artfully messy bun. Cameron trailed behind her, looking slightly out of breath and carrying an enormous gift bag. Sorry, Vanessa called out, rushing over to give me a hug that smelled like her signature vanilla perfume. Cameron's car wouldn't start. Then we had to stop for gas. And then there was this accident on the bridge. She gestured vaguely in the direction of downtown Portland. Cameron offered a sheepish smile and a small wave. He was always quiet at family gatherings, content to let Vanessa fill the conversational space. I'd attributed it to shyness when they first started dating, but even after they'd been married for months, he remained somewhat distant from the rest of us. Derek had mentioned once that he found Cameron hard to read, but I'd chalked it up to personality differences. Not everyone could be as naturally social as my sister. "No worries," I said, squeezing Vanessa's hand. "You're here now, and that's what matters." The guests began arriving at 2 o'clock sharp. Derek's parents drove in from Salem, bringing homemade cookies and excited grandparent energy. My college roommate Zoe showed up with her new boyfriend Tyler, and my co-workers from the marketing firm filled in the gaps with cheerful chatter about baby names and nursery themes. Everyone seemed genuinely thrilled to be there, asking about my pregnancy symptoms and sharing their own parenting stories. The cake sat at the center of it all, a beautiful 2-layer creation covered in smooth white fondant and decorated with delicate yellow roses. It looked innocent enough, but inside it held the answer to the question that had been keeping me up at night with excitement. A daughter to dress up and read bedtime stories to, or a son to teach how to ride bikes and throw baseballs with Derek. As 3 o'clock approached, the crowd gathered around the pavilion's main table. Derek and I stood behind the cake, his arm around my waist, both of us grinning like kids on Christmas morning. I could see my parents beaming from the front of the crowd, Dad already recording on his phone despite Mom's whispered reminders about living in the moment instead of behind a screen. "Okay, everyone," I called out, my voice carrying across the pavilion. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate with us. Derek and I are so excited to share this moment with the people we love most." The crowd settled into expectant silence. Someone's child whispered loudly about wanting cake, earning gentle shushes from their parent. Derek handed me the knife, its silver surface reflecting the afternoon light filtering through the pavilion roof. "On the count of 3, Derek announced. 1, 2. That's when the fire alarm started shrieking. The sound was deafening, a piercing wail that sent everyone's hands flying to their ears. Panic rippled through the crowd as people looked around for signs of smoke or flames. The park's emergency sprinkler system activated, sending sprays of cold water cascading down from the pavilion's ceiling. Chaos erupted. Guests grabbed their purses and jackets, running for cover under nearby trees. The beautiful cake, our centerpiece, was immediately soaked. The white fondant began to dissolve and slide off in soggy chunks, revealing glimpses of the inside that I couldn't quite make out through the confusion. I stood frozen in the middle of it all, knife still in my hand, watching our perfect day dissolve as quickly as the fondant roses. Derek grabbed my shoulders and steered me toward the parking lot, away from the artificial downpour that was turning our celebration into a disaster movie scene. "What happened?" I shouted over the alarm, which showed no signs of stopping. "I don't know," Derek yelled back, pulling his jacket off to drape over my shoulders. Someone must have pulled the emergency alarm. Through the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Vanessa and Cameron near the pavilion's edge. While everyone else was running away from the sprinklers, Vanessa seemed to be moving toward them, her phone in her hand. For a moment, I thought she might be trying to document the disaster, but something about her posture struck me as odd. She looked focused, almost purposeful, rather than panicked like everyone else. The park rangers arrived within minutes, followed closely by the fire department. After a thorough sweep of the area revealed no actual emergency, they determined that someone had indeed pulled the alarm manually. There were 3 emergency pull stations scattered around the pavilion area, any one of which could have triggered the system. "Who would do something like that?" my mother asked, wringing water from her cardigan. "And why?" Nobody had an answer. The rangers took a few statements, but with 30-plus people milling around the area, it was impossible to determine who might have been near the alarm stations when the system activated. The general consensus was that it had probably been an accident, maybe a child playing with something they didn't understand. By the time the all-clear was given and the sprinklers finally stopped, our gender reveal party was effectively over. The cake was ruined, the decorations were soaked, and half the guests had already left to change into dry clothes. Derek and I stood in the parking lot, surveying the wreckage of our special day. "We can reschedule," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe next weekend?" I nodded, but my heart wasn't in it. The moment had been lost, and there's no recreating that kind of anticipation once it's gone. Besides, by next weekend, we'd probably just end up telling people the gender anyway. The surprise would be ruined. Vanessa approached us as we were loading the soggy remnants of our party supplies into Derek's truck. Her dress was mostly dry, I noticed, which seemed odd considering how close to the sprinklers I'd seen her standing. "I am so sorry," she said, and her voice carried that particular tone of distress that Vanessa had perfected over the years. "This is awful. Your beautiful party, completely ruined." "It's not your fault," I said automatically, though something in my chest felt tight. "These things happen." "But on today of all days," she continued, shaking her head. "And you put so much work into planning everything perfectly. The decorations, the cake, getting everyone together." She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the wet pavilion. Cameron stood quietly beside her, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. When I looked at him, he offered a sympathetic smile but didn't say anything. I realized I couldn't remember hearing him speak at all during the party, which wasn't entirely unusual but seemed more noticeable now in the aftermath. "We should get you home," Vanessa said, reaching out to squeeze my arm. "You're soaking wet, and you need to think about the baby."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She was right, of course. My dress was clinging to my skin, and I was starting to shiver despite Derek's jacket. But something about her concern felt performative, like she was saying what she thought a caring sister should say rather than expressing genuine emotion. "Yeah," I agreed. "I think we're done here." As Derek and I drove home through the Portland drizzle that seemed to mock our ruined outdoor party, I found myself replaying the afternoon in my mind. The fire alarm, the chaos, the way Vanessa had seemed so close to the sprinkler zone when everyone else was running away. It was probably nothing, just my pregnancy hormones making me paranoid and emotional. But as we pulled into our driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about today had been deliberately wrong. That evening, I sat on our couch with a cup of herbal tea, scrolling through my phone while Derek made dinner. Several of our guests had already posted about the party on social media, most of them treating it as a funny story about Murphy's Law and the unpredictability of outdoor events. Zoe had posted a photo of the soaked pavilion with the caption, "When nature has other plans for your gender reveal," followed by laughing emojis. But then I saw Vanessa's post. It was a selfie of her and Cameron taken in what looked like their car, both of them looking slightly damp but smiling. The caption read, "Sometimes the best laid plans go awry, but that's what makes life an adventure. So proud of my little sister and can't wait to meet my future niece or nephew. Love you, Natalie." The post had been uploaded at 3:47 p.m., less than an hour after the alarm had gone off, which meant she'd taken the time to compose and post a cheerful message about the disaster, while Derek and I were still standing in the parking lot, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I stared at the post for a long moment, trying to identify why it bothered me so much. Maybe it was the timing. Or maybe it was how perfectly composed Vanessa looked, despite having been caught in the same sprinkler chaos as everyone else. Or maybe it was the way she'd managed to turn our ruined day into content for her social media presence. "Dinner's ready," Derek called from the kitchen, and I set my phone aside. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain against our bedroom windows, I couldn't stop thinking about the fire alarm, about Vanessa's dry dress and her perfectly timed social media post, about the way Cameron had remained silent through the entire aftermath, as if he'd been waiting for something. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Vanessa was my sister, and she loved me. She'd been genuinely excited about becoming an aunt. There was no reason for her to sabotage my gender reveal party, and even if she'd wanted to for some inexplicable reason, pulling a fire alarm seemed like an extreme and dangerous way to do it. But sleep eluded me that night, and when I finally drifted off near dawn, I dreamed of alarms and sprinklers and secrets hiding behind smiling faces. The next morning arrived with that crisp October clarity that only comes after a storm has washed the air clean. I woke up earlier than usual, my mind already racing despite the early hour. Derek was still sleeping beside me, one arm thrown over his pillow, completely peaceful in a way I envied. The baby was active this morning, little flutters that felt like butterfly wings against my ribs, as if sensing my restless energy. I slipped out of bed quietly and padded to the kitchen, where I made myself a cup of decaf coffee and sat at our small dining table. Through the window, I could see the neighborhood slowly coming to life. Mrs. Chen from next door was already tending to her garden, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking with enthusiasm about something only it could understand. My phone lay silent on the table, but I found myself staring at it anyway, thinking about Vanessa's social media post from yesterday. Something about it continued to nag at me, like a song stuck in my head that I couldn't quite place. I picked up the phone and scrolled back to her Instagram, studying the photo more carefully in the morning light. There she was, smiling brightly in what appeared to be the passenger seat of Cameron's Honda Civic. Her hair was slightly mussed but not soaking wet like mine had been. Her makeup was still intact, mascara unsmudged despite the chaos of sprinklers and panicked guests. Cameron sat beside her in the driver's seat, and while his shirt looked damp around the collar, he too seemed remarkably put together for someone who'd just escaped an emergency situation. I zoomed in on the background visible through their car windows. The image was slightly blurry, but I could make out what looked like the Laurelhurst Park parking lot. Trees, other cars, the distinctive green of the park's landscape. But here's what struck me as I examined it more closely. The timestamp on the photo's metadata showed it had been taken at 3:23 p.m., which would have been right in the middle of the alarm chaos, not after everyone had retreated to safety. Who takes a selfie during an emergency? I set the phone down and rubbed my temples, trying to organize my thoughts. Maybe I was reading too much into this. Pregnancy brain was a real thing, and I'd been under a lot of stress lately with work deadlines piling up alongside baby preparations. It was entirely possible that I was manufacturing suspicion where none existed. But then I remembered something else. Yesterday, while we were cleaning up the waterlogged remains of our party, Vanessa had mentioned knowing exactly which pull station had been activated. She'd pointed toward the one near the pavilion's east entrance, and said something about how that one's always been sensitive, as if she'd had experience with it before. At the time, I'd been too overwhelmed to process the comment fully, but now it seemed oddly specific. How would Vanessa know about the sensitivity of emergency equipment at a park pavilion she'd only visited once before, for Derek's and my wedding reception 2 years ago? Derek emerged from the bedroom around 8, hair sticking up at impossible angles and wearing the faded college t-shirt he'd had since before we met. "Morning, beautiful," he mumbled, dropping a kiss on top of my head as he passed toward the coffee maker. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said, watching him navigate our morning routine with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd been sharing space with me for 3 years. "Just thinking about yesterday." He paused in measuring coffee grounds and turned to look at me. "Hey, I know it didn't go the way we planned, but we'll figure out another way to share the news. Maybe we'll just make a cute announcement video or something. Post it online for everyone to see." "It's not about that," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how to articulate what it actually was about. "Derek, did anything seem strange to you yesterday? About how everything happened?" He finished starting the coffee and came to sit across from me at the table. "Strange how? You mean besides someone randomly pulling a fire alarm?" "I don't think it was random." The words hung in the air between us. Derek's expression shifted from sleepy confusion to something more alert, more concerned. "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone and showed him Vanessa's Instagram post, explaining my observations about the timing and their remarkably dry appearances. Derek listened without interrupting, his dark eyes growing more serious as I spoke. "Nat," he said carefully when I finished, "I know yesterday was disappointing, but are you really suggesting that your sister deliberately sabotaged our party?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I said, though even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'm just saying there are some things that don't add up." Derek reached across the table and took my hand. "Pregnancy can make us paranoid sometimes. You know that, right? The hormones, the stress, the way everything feels more intense when you're growing a human being. Maybe you're just looking for someone to blame because the whole situation sucked." He wasn't wrong about pregnancy affecting my emotional state. I'd definitely been more sensitive lately, crying at commercials and getting irrationally angry when the grocery store rearranged their produce section. But this felt different. This felt like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together, and my brain was trying to force them into place. You might be right, I conceded, squeezing his hand. But would you mind if I asked a few questions? Just to put my mind at ease? Derek studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly. What kind of questions? I want to call the park and ask about their emergency system, find out if they have any security footage from yesterday, or if they've had problems with false alarms before, and maybe check with some of our guests, see if anyone noticed anything unusual. Okay, Derek said, though his tone suggested he thought this was probably unnecessary. Just promise me you won't let this consume you. We have bigger things to focus on right now. He was referring to the baby, of course. Our 20-week anatomy scan was scheduled for Thursday, just 4 days away. We'd finally get detailed images of our little one, confirmation that everything was developing normally, and yes, we'd learned the gender that yesterday's ruined cake had been meant to reveal. I promise, I said, and meant it. I just need to scratch this itch, and then I'll let it go. After Derek left for his job at the architectural firm downtown, I spent the morning making phone calls. The Portland Parks and Recreation Department was helpful, but not particularly enlightening. Yes, they had security cameras in some areas of Laurelhurst Park, but the pavilion where we'd held our party wasn't covered by their surveillance system. The emergency alarm that had been activated was indeed the one near the east entrance, just as Vanessa had somehow known. False alarms weren't uncommon, especially during busy weekend events, when children might be curious about the bright red pull stations. Could you tell me exactly what time the alarm was triggered? I asked the facilities coordinator I'd been transferred to. Let me check our incident log, she said, and I heard the sound of papers rustling through the phone. Here it is. Emergency notification system activated at 3:14 p.m. on October 15th. Deactivated at 3:31 p.m. after fire department clearance. I wrote down the times on the notepad I kept by our landline. 3:14 p.m. meant the alarm had gone off just as Derek was beginning his countdown for the cake cutting. The timing couldn't have been more perfectly disruptive if someone had planned it that way. Is there any way to tell which specific pull station was used? I asked. Actually, yes. Our newer systems logged that information. Shows it was the Station C, that's the one on the east side of the covered pavilion. I thanked her and hung up, staring at my notes. Station C, east side of the pavilion. I tried to visualize where everyone had been standing when the alarm went off. Derek and I had been behind the cake table, which was positioned roughly in the center of the pavilion. Most of our guests had been gathered in a semicircle facing us, creating a clear line of sight to the cake cutting. The east side of the pavilion would have been somewhat peripheral to the main action, not a place where most people would have been standing during the ceremony. But it would have been easily accessible to someone who wanted to slip away from the crowd without being noticed. I decided to call Zoe, my college roommate who'd been at the party with her boyfriend Tyler. If anyone would have noticed something out of place, it would be Zoe. She had a photographer's eye for detail and a natural curiosity about people's behavior. Hey girl, Zoe answered on the second ring. How are you feeling after yesterday's disaster? That's actually why I'm calling, I said. I know this might sound weird, but did you notice anything strange before the fire alarm went off? Anyone acting unusually or wandering away from the group? There was a pause. Strange how? I mean, everyone seemed pretty focused on watching you and Derek cut the cake. I don't know exactly. Just anything that struck you as off. Zoe was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her thinking. Well, now that you mention it, Tyler did say something about seeing someone near the edge of the pavilion, right before the alarm started. He thought maybe they were taking photos of the scenery or something. My pulse quickened. Did he see who it was? I don't think so. He was pretty focused on trying to get a good angle to film your cake cutting with his phone. But he mentioned it because whoever it was seemed to be moving toward the parking lot right when the chaos started, like they knew what was about to happen. Could you ask him if he remembers anything else? What the person was wearing, maybe, or if he got them in any of his footage. Sure, I'll text him now. But Natalie, why are you asking? Do you think someone set off that alarm on purpose? I hesitated. Voicing my suspicions to Derek had been one thing, but saying them out loud to someone else felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. I'm probably just being paranoid, I said finally. Yesterday was such a letdown, and I guess I'm looking for reasons why everything went wrong. That's totally understandable, Zoe said, her voice warm with sympathy. planning something special and having it ruined would mess with anyone's head. But hey, Tyler actually got some video before the alarm went off. Want me to send it to you? Maybe seeing happy moments from before everything went sideways will help. I almost said no, thinking that reliving the day would just make me feel worse. But then I realized that Tyler's video might show more than just happy moments. It might show exactly who was where when the alarm was triggered. That would be great, I said. Thanks, Zoe. The video arrived in my text messages about an hour later, a 3-minute clip that Tyler had apparently edited together from several shorter recordings. It started with Derek and me arranging the cake on the table, both of us grinning and clearly excited. The camera panned across our gathered friends and family, capturing the warm, anticipatory atmosphere that had filled the pavilion. I watched myself smoothing down my yellow dress and laughing at something Derek whispered in my ear. There were my parents, Mom adjusting the flower arrangement, while Dad tested different angles for his own recording. There was Derek's mom, chatting animatedly with my coworker Janet about baby names. And there, at the edge of the frame, was Vanessa. She appeared about halfway through the video, walking purposefully toward the pavilion's eastern edge. The camera wasn't focused on her, so her image was slightly blurry, but I could clearly see her emerald dress and auburn hair. What struck me was how different her body language looked compared to everyone else. While the other guests were relaxed and social, clustering together and chatting, Vanessa moved with what looked like determination. She glanced around briefly, almost furtively, then disappeared from the camera's view. The timestamp on Tyler's video showed 3:12 p.m., 2 minutes before the alarm went off. I rewound and watched that section again, my heart beating faster. There was something about Vanessa's movement that looked deliberate, planned. She wasn't wandering aimlessly or looking for a better view of the cake cutting. She was heading somewhere specific. Tyler's video cut off abruptly when the fire alarm started shrieking, the screen going chaotic as he obviously lowered his phone in confusion. But those few seconds before the alarm had captured something important. My sister moving toward the exact area where the emergency pull station was located, just minutes before someone activated it. I sat on my couch for a long time after the video ended, staring at my phone's blank screen and trying to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't conclusive proof of anything. Exactly. Vanessa could have been heading toward the restroom facilities, which were located in that general direction. She could have been stepping aside to take a phone call, or looking for a trash can, or any number of innocent activities. But combined with her oddly dry appearance afterward, her perfectly timed social media post, and her specific knowledge about which alarm station had been triggered, Tyler's video felt like another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed my mother's number. "Hi, Mom," I answered, trying to sound normal. "Hello, sweetheart. I was just calling to check on you after yesterday's excitement. Are you feeling all right? You looked so disappointed when everything got ruined." "I'm okay," I said. "Just tired, I guess." Well, that's to be expected. Growing a baby is exhausting work, and all that chaos with the fire alarms certainly didn't help. Your father and I were just saying how sorry we felt for you and Derek. All that planning and then some random accident ruins everything. Random accident. That's what everyone kept calling it. And until this morning, I'd been willing to accept that explanation too. But now the word random stuck in my throat like a bone. "Mom," I said carefully, "did you notice anyone acting strangely before the alarm went off? Anyone who seemed to wander away from the group?" "Oh, honey, there were so many people there, and everyone was moving around, getting ready for the big moment." "Why do you ask?" I almost told her about my growing suspicions, but something held me back. Mom and Vanessa had always been close, maybe even closer than Mom and I were. Vanessa had inherited Mom's artistic temperament and social ease, while I'd gotten Dad's practical nature and tendency toward introversion. If I was wrong about what I thought I'd discovered, I didn't want to create family drama over nothing. "Just curious," I said. "It's probably silly, but I keep trying to figure out how everything went so wrong so quickly." "These things happen, sweetheart. That's why they call them accidents. I'm sure whoever pulled that alarm feels terrible about ruining your party." After I hung up with Mom, I found myself walking restlessly around our apartment, unable to settle into any activity. The baby was active too, as if picking up on my agitated energy. I tried to read, tried to work on the nursery organization I'd been putting off, tried to focus on the thank you notes I needed to write for the baby shower gifts we'd already received. But my mind kept circling back to that video clip, to the purposeful way Vanessa had moved toward the east side of the pavilion. I thought about her marriage to Cameron, how quickly they'd gotten engaged after only 6 months of dating, how private Cameron seemed to be about his background and family. Vanessa had mentioned once that his parents lived somewhere back east, and that they weren't very close, but she'd been vague about the details. Actually, now that I thought about it, Vanessa had been vague about a lot of things related to Cameron. When they'd announced their engagement, I'd asked her the usual sister questions about how he'd proposed, where they were planning to honeymoon, what had made her know he was the one. Her answers had been surprisingly generic, like she was reciting from a script rather than sharing personal experiences. I'd attributed it to Vanessa being private about her romantic relationships, but that had never been her style before. She'd always been an oversharer when it came to dating, calling me with detailed analyses of text message conversations and asking for advice about everything from outfit choices to relationship milestones. Her sudden discretion about Cameron had been so different from her usual patterns that I'd actually found it refreshing at the time. Now I wondered if there had been something else behind her reticence. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, I decided to drive over to Selwood, the neighborhood where Cameron worked. Vanessa had mentioned once that he was employed by a small tech startup that developed apps for restaurants, though she'd been typically vague about the details. I wasn't entirely sure what I hoped to accomplish by going there, but sitting in my apartment analyzing and reanalyzing the same pieces of information was driving me crazy. Selwood was one of Portland's quieter neighborhoods, a mix of residential streets and small commercial districts that had managed to avoid much of the rapid gentrification happening in other parts of the city. I drove slowly through the area, looking for anything that might be obviously tech-related. Modern office buildings, startup-style signage, the kind of converted warehouse spaces that seem to attract young companies. I didn't find anything that screamed, Cameron's workplace, but I did discover something else interesting. As I was driving down 13th Avenue, I passed a small medical clinic with a rainbow flag displayed prominently in their window. Below the flag was a sign that read, Pacific Northwest Gender Health Services, comprehensive care for transgender and gender non-conforming individuals. I almost drove past without thinking much about it, but something made me slow down and take a closer look. The clinic was housed in a converted Victorian home, painted a welcoming shade of blue with flower boxes under the windows. It looked professional but not intimidating, the kind of place that had been designed to feel safe and inclusive. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a few minutes, not entirely sure why this particular building had caught my attention. Maybe it was because I'd been thinking so much about gender lately, with our ruined gender reveal party and the upcoming anatomy scan. Maybe it was because I'd been questioning everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. Or maybe it was because I'd just remembered something Vanessa had said a few months ago, something that hadn't seemed significant at the time but now felt like it might be important. We'd been having lunch at that little cafe in Pearl District, and she'd mentioned that Cameron had been going to a lot of medical appointments lately. Nothing serious, she'd assured me quickly, just some ongoing health monitoring that his doctor recommended. When I'd asked if everything was okay, she'd gotten that vague expression she'd perfected since getting married, and said something about how everyone's health needs were different. At the time, I'd assumed she was just being respectful of Cameron's privacy. Now I found myself wondering what kind of health monitoring required regular appointments, and why Vanessa would be so evasive about something that was supposedly routine. I sat in my car across from the gender clinic for almost 20 minutes, watching people come and go. The clientele was diverse. Young people who looked like college students, older adults who moved with the confidence of people comfortable in their own skin, families with teenagers who clung to their parents' hands. Everyone looked normal, every day, like they could be anyone's neighbors or coworkers or relatives. And that's when it hit me. They could be anyone's relatives, anyone's spouse, anyone's brother-in-law who'd married into a family without sharing all the details of their personal history. I started my car and drove home slowly, my mind racing faster than my hands could safely navigate Portland traffic. I was probably jumping to conclusions, connecting dots that didn't actually form a coherent picture. But for the first time since yesterday's disaster, I felt like I might be asking the right questions. When I got home, Derek was already there, sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open and architectural drawings spread around him. He looked up when I walked in, his expression shifting from concentration to concern. "How was your day of investigating?" he asked, and though his tone was gentle, I detected a hint of worry underneath. "Enlightening," I said, dropping my purse on the counter. "Derek, what do you actually know about Cameron? I mean, really know, beyond what Vanessa has told us?" Derek closed his laptop and gave me his full attention. "That's a weird question. Why?" "Just humor me. What do you know about his background, his family, his life before he met Vanessa?" Derek was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. "Honestly? Not much. He's quiet, keeps to himself, works in tech, grew up somewhere on the East Coast. His parents aren't in the picture much. He and Vanessa seem happy together." "But you've never actually talked to him about any of that stuff yourself?" "No, I guess not. He's not much of a talker. You know, whenever we're all together, Vanessa usually dominates the conversation, and he just kind of goes along with whatever she says." I nodded, feeling a familiar puzzle piece click into place. "Have you ever noticed anything else about him? Anything that seemed unusual or inconsistent?" Derek's frown deepened. "Natalie, where is this going? You're starting to worry me." I took a deep breath and sat down across from him. "I think Cameron might be transgender." The words hung in the air between us like a confession. Derek's eyebrows shot up, and he leaned back in his chair as if I'd physically pushed him. "What? Why would you think that?" I told him about the gender clinic I'd seen, about Vanessa's comments regarding Cameron's medical appointments, about all the small inconsistencies that had been nagging at me since their wedding. Derek listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as I spoke. "Even if that were true," he said when I finished, "what would it have to do with the fire alarm yesterday?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I think there's more to this story than we understand, and I think Vanessa is hiding something big." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a ruined party. Derek had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion from a long day of client meetings, but I suspected he was also trying to avoid further conversation about my theories regarding Cameron. I couldn't blame him. Even to me, the idea sounded far-fetched when spoken aloud. But lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while rain drummed against our windows, I found myself mentally cataloging every interaction I'd ever had with my brother-in-law. The way he always seemed slightly uncomfortable during family photos, positioning himself carefully and never seeming fully relaxed. How he declined to join Derek and my dad for their traditional pre-wedding golf outing, claiming a back injury that Vanessa had explained away vaguely. The fact that he'd worn a suit jacket throughout their entire wedding reception, even during the dancing, despite the unusually warm August evening. Small things, individually meaningless, but together, they formed a pattern that felt increasingly significant. I must have finally drifted off sometime near dawn, because I woke to my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The caller ID showed Zoe's name, and the clock read 7:23 a.m. "Sorry to call so early," Zoe said without preamble when I answered, "but Tyler remembered something else about yesterday, and I thought you'd want to know right away." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What did he remember?" "He said after he sent you that video, he went back through all the footage on his phone, including the stuff he recorded, after the alarm stopped. There's a clip of people in the parking lot, everyone looking confused and wet, and he noticed something weird about your sister and Cameron." My heart started beating faster. "Weird how?" "Well, you know how everyone was soaked and disheveled, right? Tyler said Cameron looked like he'd been caught in the sprinklers just like everyone else, but Vanessa looked almost completely dry. And here's the really strange part. In the footage, you can see them having what looks like an intense conversation by their car. Cameron appears upset about something, and Vanessa keeps looking around like she's worried someone might overhear them." I gripped the phone tighter. Did Tyler catch any of what they were saying? No, he was too far away. and there was too much background noise from people talking and car doors slamming. But he said their body language looked like they were arguing, not just discussing the chaos like everyone else was. After I hung up with Zoe, I sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes, processing this new information. If Vanessa and Cameron had been arguing in the parking lot while everyone else was dealing with the aftermath of the alarm, it suggested that whatever had happened wasn't as much of a surprise to them as they'd pretended. Derek was already in the shower, so I had the apartment to myself as I made coffee and tried to organize my thoughts. The logical part of my brain kept insisting that I was constructing an elaborate conspiracy theory out of coincidences and pregnancy hormones. But the intuitive part, the part that had always been good at reading people and situations, whispered that something was definitely wrong. I decided to do something that felt both justified and slightly unethical. I was going to look up Cameron Walsh online. It's embarrassing to admit, but in the year and a half since Vanessa had introduced Cameron to our family, I'd never actually searched for him on social media or tried to learn more about his background independently. He'd seemed nice enough, if quiet, and Vanessa had appeared happy. I'd assumed that was enough. Now, sitting at my laptop with a cup of decaf coffee and 20 minutes before Derek finished his morning routine, I opened a new browser window and typed Cameron Walsh, Portland, Oregon into the search bar. The results were surprisingly sparse. A few LinkedIn profiles for people with similar names but clearly different identities, some random mentions in local business directories, but nothing that obviously connected to my brother-in-law. I tried variations. Cameron Walsh Tech Startup, Cameron Walsh Restaurant Apps, even just Cameron Walsh without location modifiers. Still nothing that matched the person I knew. I switched to Facebook and Instagram, searching both platforms thoroughly. Again, several Cameron Walshes appeared in the results, but none of them were the man who'd married my sister. I found this strange, considering that most people our age maintained at least some kind of social media presence, even if they kept their profiles private. Then I tried searching for Vanessa's social media accounts to see if she'd tagged Cameron in any posts that might give me more information about his online presence. Her Instagram was easy to find, and I scrolled back through months of posts looking for mentions or tags of her husband. What I discovered was odd. While Vanessa frequently posted photos that included Cameron, she almost never tagged him. The few times she had, the tag led to an account called @C_Walsh_PDX that appeared to have been created only 18 months ago, right around the time they'd started dating. The account had exactly 12 posts, all of them innocuous photos of Portland landscapes and food, with no personal information visible. 18 months. For someone who supposedly grew up on the East Coast and had lived in Portland for several years before meeting Vanessa, Cameron's social media footprint was remarkably recent and remarkably thin. I was still staring at Cameron's sparse Instagram profile when Derek emerged from the bedroom, dressed for work and smelling like the cedar-scented soap his mother sent him every Christmas. "Morning, detective," he said, dropping a kiss on top of my head as he passed toward the coffee maker. "Find any smoking guns in your investigation?" His tone was light, but I detected an undercurrent of concern. Derek had always been the practical one in our relationship, the voice of reason when my imagination ran away with me. Usually, I appreciated his grounding influence. Today, it felt slightly patronizing. "Maybe," I said, closing the laptop. "Cameron barely exists online. No real social media presence, no digital footprint that I can find. Don't you think that's unusual for someone our age?" Derek poured coffee into his travel mug and considered this. "Some people just prefer privacy. Not everyone wants their whole life documented on the internet. But this isn't just preferring privacy. It's like he didn't exist before 18 months ago. Or maybe he cleaned up his online presence when he started dating your sister. Some people do that when they get serious about someone, especially if they're job hunting or want to present a more professional image." Derek's explanations were logical, reasonable. They were also exactly the kind of explanations I'd been giving myself whenever something about Cameron had seemed slightly off. But adding them to everything else I'd observed was starting to create a picture that felt less and less innocent. "Derek," I said carefully, "what if I'm right? What if Cameron is transgender? And what if that's somehow connected to what happened at our party?" Derek paused in gathering his work materials and looked at me seriously. "Nat, even if Cameron is trans, which is pure speculation on your part, Being transgender isn't something people typically try to hide by sabotaging their relatives' parties. That doesn't make any sense. But what if there's more to it? What if there's something about their situation that we don't understand? Derek came over and sat down beside me, taking my hands in his. Listen, I love that you care about people and pay attention to details. It's one of the things I fell in love with about you. But I'm worried that you're letting yesterday's disappointment turn into something bigger than it needs to be. Vanessa loves you. She was excited about our baby. There's no reason she would want to ruin our gender reveal. I wanted to argue, to share all the small observations and inconsistencies that were piling up in my mind, but Derek's expression was so genuinely concerned, so loving, that I found myself nodding instead. You're probably right, I said. I'm probably just looking for someone to blame because I'm disappointed. Derek smiled and kissed my forehead. That's totally understandable. But try to focus on the positive stuff, okay? We have our anatomy scan on Thursday. We'll finally get to see our baby and find out if we're having a little boy or girl. That's what matters. After Derek left for work, I tried to follow his advice and focus on positive things. I worked on organizing the baby clothes we'd already received, started researching pediatricians in our area, and even began sketching ideas for the nursery's color scheme. But my mind kept wandering back to the questions that felt increasingly urgent. Around noon, I made a decision that I knew Derek wouldn't approve of. I was going to drive to Vanessa's house and have a direct conversation with her about what had happened at the party. Vanessa and Cameron lived in a small bungalow in the Alberta Arts District, a neighborhood that had transformed dramatically in the past decade, from working-class residential to trendy creative hub. Their house was painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, and Vanessa had spent months cultivating the perfect combination of flowers and vegetables in their front yard garden. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to decide how to approach this conversation. I couldn't exactly accuse my sister of deliberately sabotaging my party without more evidence than I currently had. But I could ask some careful questions and see how she responded. Cameron's Honda Civic wasn't in the driveway, which meant he was probably at work. This was actually preferable, since I thought Vanessa might be more likely to open up if we were alone. I knocked on the front door and waited, rehearsing opening lines in my head. When Vanessa opened the door, she looked genuinely surprised to see me. Natalie, what are you doing here? She was wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked comfortable and relaxed, not like someone harboring guilty secrets. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by, I said, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't exactly a lie either. Do you have a few minutes to chat? Of course. Come in, come in. I was just having lunch and catching up on some freelance work. Vanessa stepped aside to let me enter. Their living room was exactly what you'd expect from Vanessa. Eclectic furniture in jewel tones, plants everywhere, art covering most of the available wall space. It was warm and inviting, the kind of space that immediately made you want to curl up with a book and stay for hours. Can I get you anything? Herbal tea? I think I have some of that ginger stuff that's supposed to be good for pregnancy. Tea sounds great, I said, settling onto their purple velvet couch. While Vanessa busied herself in the kitchen, I looked around the room more carefully than I ever had before, searching for clues about Cameron's background or their relationship. Most of the visible photos were of Vanessa, either alone or with friends and family. There were a few pictures of her and Cameron together, but they were all recent, clearly taken after they'd started dating. What struck me was the absence of the kinds of personal artifacts you'd typically expect to see in a couple's shared living space. No photos of Cameron with his own friends or family. No books or objects that seemed clearly attributable to his interests or personality. The space felt like Vanessa's house with Cameron as a guest, rather than a home they'd created together. Here we go, Vanessa said, returning with 2 steaming mugs. Ginger lemon, perfect for queasy pregnant ladies. I accepted the tea gratefully, using the moment of sipping and settling to figure out how to begin this conversation. Vanessa, I said finally, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the party yesterday. Her expression immediately became more guarded. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry about that. Such a random disaster. I know how much that party meant to you. That's just it, I said carefully. I'm starting to wonder if it was really random. Vanessa paused with her mug halfway to her lips. What do you mean? I mean, the timing was awfully convenient. Right as Derek and I were about to cut the cake, right at the moment when everyone's attention was focused on us. Natalie, are you suggesting that someone pulled that alarm on purpose? Vanessa's voice carried a note of disbelief that sounded genuine, but something about her posture had shifted. She was sitting straighter, more alert. I don't know, I said, watching her face carefully. But I've been thinking about how dry you looked afterward, when everyone else was soaked. And that Instagram post you made so quickly, while Derek and I were still trying to figure out what had happened. Vanessa set down her mug and stared at me. Are you accusing me of something? The directness of her question caught me off guard. I'd expected deflection or explanation, not this calm challenge. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, I said. I'm just trying to understand what happened, and some things don't seem to add up. Like what? I took a deep breath. This was the moment where I either committed to this line of questioning or backed down. Like how you knew which alarm station had been activated. Like how you and Cameron seemed to be having an argument in the parking lot afterward. Like how you seemed to know exactly where to be to avoid getting soaked. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an expression I couldn't read. When she finally spoke, her voice was very calm. Natalie, I think your pregnancy hormones are making you paranoid. You're looking for someone to blame for what was just a really unfortunate accident. It was almost exactly what Derek had said, word for word. The similarity struck me as too convenient to be coincidental. Maybe, I said. But I noticed something else too. Cameron doesn't seem to have much of a digital footprint. No real social media presence, no online history that I can find. That seems unusual. Something flickered across Vanessa's face, so quickly that I almost missed it. Fear, maybe, or anger. But when she spoke, her voice remained level. Some people value their privacy. Cameron had some bad experiences with social media before we met, so he keeps a low profile online. What kind of bad experiences? Personal stuff. It's not really my story to tell. I nodded as if this explanation satisfied me, but internally I was noting how quickly Vanessa had pivoted to protecting Cameron's privacy. It felt like a deflection. Can I ask you something else? I said. About Cameron's health appointments. You mentioned a while back that he was doing some kind of regular monitoring with his doctor. Vanessa's entire body went still. What about it? Is everything okay? With his health, I mean. You seemed worried when you mentioned it. He's fine, Vanessa said quickly. Just routine stuff. Everyone has different health needs as they get older. But her casual tone didn't match her body language. She was gripping her tea mug tightly, and I noticed that her breathing had become slightly shallow. Vanessa, I said gently, if something's going on, you know you can talk to me about it, right? I'm your sister. I love you, and I love Cameron too. If there's something you're dealing with, I want to help. For a moment, Vanessa's carefully controlled expression cracked, and I saw something raw and vulnerable underneath. But then she seemed to catch herself, and the mask slipped back into place. There's nothing to deal with, she said. Everything's fine. Cameron's fine. Our marriage is fine. The only thing that's not fine is you creating conspiracy theories about people who love you. The conversation was clearly over. I could see it in the set of Vanessa's shoulders, in the way she'd positioned herself slightly farther away from me on the couch. I'd pushed too hard, revealed too much of my suspicions, and now she was in full defensive mode. You're right, I said, standing up. I'm probably just being oversensitive about everything. Pregnancy brain is real. Vanessa walked me to the door, but the easy warmth that had characterized our interaction at the beginning of my visit was gone. She hugged me goodbye, but it felt perfunctory. Take care of yourself, okay? She said, and try not to stress about things that don't matter. Focus on that beautiful baby you're growing. As I drove away from Vanessa's house, I felt more confused than ever. The conversation had confirmed some of my suspicions while raising new questions. Vanessa was definitely hiding something, but I still didn't know what, and I had no idea how it connected to the fire alarm incident. I decided to make one more stop before going home. The Pacific Northwest Gender Health Services clinic I'd seen yesterday was only a few miles from Vanessa's neighborhood, and I found myself driving toward it almost without conscious decision. I parked across the street again and sat in my car, watching people enter and exit the building. What was I hoping to accomplish here? I couldn't exactly march into a medical facility and demand to know if Cameron Walsh was a patient. Even if he was, that information would be confidential. But as I sat there, thinking about privacy and medical records and the strange gaps in Cameron's online presence, an idea began to form. It was probably a long shot, and it definitely fell into the category of activities that Derek would not approve of. But it might give me some actual answers, instead of just more questions. I pulled out my phone and called the clinic's main number. Pacific Northwest Gender Health Services. This is Maria speaking. How can I help you? Hi, I said, trying to sound casual. I'm calling to confirm an appointment for my husband, Cameron Walsh. He thinks it might be scheduled for this week, but he can't remember the exact time. Let me check our system, Maria said. Can you spell the last name for me? Walsh. There was a pause while she presumably searched their database. I'm not seeing a Cameron Walsh in our system. Are you sure he's a patient here? My heart sank. Oh, maybe I have the wrong clinic. He mentioned something about gender health services, so I assumed. Could you double check? Maybe under a different first name? Chris Walsh or Christopher? Another pause. No, I'm not finding any Walsh at all in our current patient database. Is it possible your husband is a patient at one of our partner clinics? Maybe, I said. Could you give me the names of your partner clinics? I'll try calling them. Maria rattled off a list of 3 other medical facilities in the Portland area that provided similar services. I thanked her and hung up, feeling deflated. Either Cameron wasn't receiving gender-related medical care at all, or he was using a different name, or he was going somewhere that wasn't affiliated with the most obvious clinic in the area. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about names and identity in a way I never had before. If someone was transgender and transitioning, they might very well use different names in different contexts. The Cameron Walsh that everyone in my family knew might not be the name he used for medical appointments or legal documents. This possibility opened up an entirely new avenue of questions, but it also made my investigation exponentially more complicated. How do you research someone's background when you're not even sure you know their real name? That evening, Derek came home to find me sitting at our kitchen table with my laptop open and pages of handwritten notes scattered around me. He took one look at the scene and sighed. Nat, we talked about this. You were going to let it go and focus on positive things. I know, I said. But I went to see Vanessa today, and Derek, she's definitely hiding something. She got defensive and weird when I asked about Cameron, and she basically shut down the entire conversation. Derek sat down across from me and started gathering up my notes. Maybe she got defensive because her sister was interrogating her about her husband based on wild theories with no evidence. They're not wild theories, I protested. There are too many inconsistencies to ignore. Okay, Derek said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. Let's say you're right. Let's say Cameron is transgender, and let's say Vanessa is keeping that information private. So what? That's their business, not ours. It doesn't affect us. And it certainly doesn't justify this level of investigation into their personal lives. But what about the fire alarm? What about the way Vanessa acted at the party? What about it? Even if Cameron is trans, even if they have reasons for keeping that private, it doesn't mean they sabotaged our gender reveal party. Those two things aren't connected, Natalie. Derek's logic was sound, but it didn't address the growing certainty I felt that everything was connected somehow. The secretiveness, the gaps in Cameron's background, the suspicious timing of the alarm, Vanessa's defensive behavior today. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that I was frustratingly close to solving. I think they are connected, I said. I just don't know how yet. Derek closed my laptop with more force than necessary. This has to stop. You're obsessing over something that probably has a completely innocent explanation, and it's not healthy for you or the baby. Promise me you'll drop this." I looked at his concerned face and knew he was right about one thing. My investigation was becoming an obsession. But I also knew that I was too close to answers to give up now. "I promise," I said. It was a lie, but it was the lie he needed to hear to stop worrying about me. And I told myself that if I could just find a few more pieces of the puzzle, I'd be able to put Derek's concerns to rest by showing him that my instincts had been right all along. That night, after Derek fell asleep, I lay awake planning my next move. I had 2 days before our anatomy scan appointment. 2 days to find the answers that would either confirm my suspicions or prove that I'd been chasing shadows. Either way, I was going to find out the truth. The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Derek had left early for a site visit in Beaverton, and I was settling in with my morning tea when my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. "Running errands in your neighborhood today. Mind if I stop by around 10? Want to see how you're feeling after all the party excitement." I welcomed the distraction, especially since Mom might have insights about family dynamics that I'd missed. She arrived promptly at 10, carrying a bag from the organic market and wearing the concerned expression she'd perfected during my teenage years. "You look tired, sweetheart," she said, immediately launching into mother mode. "Are you getting enough sleep? Eating well? The second trimester is crucial for proper development." "I'm fine, Mom," I assured her, though I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror and realized she wasn't wrong. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my usually neat appearance looked somewhat disheveled. As we settled in the living room with cups of herbal tea, Mom launched into her typical stream of family updates. Aunt Claire's arthritis was acting up with the changing weather. Dad was considering retirement, but couldn't decide if he was ready to give up his consulting work. The Henderson family down the street had just welcomed their third grandchild. "Oh, and I had the most interesting conversation with Vanessa yesterday evening," Mom said, almost as an afterthought. "She called to check on you, said she was worried about how you seemed when you visited her." My attention sharpened immediately. "Worried how?" "Well, she mentioned that you'd been asking some unusual questions about Cameron. Something about his social media presence and medical appointments." Mom's tone was carefully neutral, but I could sense the underlying concern. She wondered if maybe the stress of the pregnancy and the disappointment about the party might be affecting your judgment. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Of course, Vanessa had called our mother. It was a classic move from our childhood. When one sister did something the other didn't like, the next step was always to involve Mom as a mediator or ally. "I wasn't interrogating anyone," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I just asked a few questions because some things seemed odd." Mom leaned forward slightly, her expression softening with maternal concern. "Honey, what kinds of things seemed odd?" I found myself in a difficult position. I couldn't share my suspicions about Cameron's gender identity without potentially violating his privacy, assuming I was even correct. But I also couldn't explain my concerns about the fire alarm incident without sounding paranoid. "Just little inconsistencies," I said finally. "Nothing concrete." "Natalie," Mom said gently, "I know you've always been observant about people, and usually your instincts are good. But sometimes when we're under stress, we can start seeing patterns that aren't really there. The mind tries to make sense of disappointment by finding someone to blame." It was the same basic message I'd been getting from Derek, now reinforced by my mother. Everyone seemed convinced that I was manufacturing a mystery where none existed. But, instead of reassuring me, this consensus made me feel more isolated and more determined to prove that my instincts weren't wrong. "Mom," I said carefully, "how well do you actually know Cameron? I mean, beyond what Vanessa has told us about him." Mom considered this question more seriously than I'd expected. "You know, that's interesting that you ask. I was just thinking the other day that in all the time he's been part of our family, I don't feel like I know much about his background. He's pleasant enough, but very private. Some people are just naturally reserved. But don't you think it's strange that we've never met his family? Or that he never talks about his childhood, his friends, from before he met Vanessa?" "Well, not everyone has close family relationships. You know that his parents live back east and that they're not particularly involved in his life. And as for childhood friends, people move on, lose touch. It's not that unusual. But even as Mom offered these reasonable explanations, I could see that my questions were making her think. Her expression had shifted from reassuring to contemplative, as if she was reconsidering things she'd previously accepted without question. There was one thing, she said slowly. At their wedding reception, I was talking to some of the guests on Cameron's side, trying to be welcoming and learn more about his background. But it was strange. Most of them seemed to be work colleagues or people he'd met relatively recently. There weren't any childhood friends, no college roommates, nobody who could tell stories about what he was like growing up. I nodded, feeling vindicated. That is strange, isn't it? I suppose it is, now that I think about it. Most weddings have at least a few people who can embarrass the bride and groom with stories from their past. Mom paused, her brow furrowing. And there was something else. When I asked one of his work friends about Cameron's college experience, the man seemed confused, like he didn't know what I was talking about. He said something about how Cameron was very private about his past. Did you mention this to Dad or Vanessa at the time? No, I just assumed that Cameron had his reasons for keeping his past private. Some people have difficult family situations or painful memories they'd rather not discuss. I didn't want to pry. Mom's observations were adding weight to my growing suspicions, but they still didn't provide concrete answers. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Natalie, Mom said eventually, if you're genuinely concerned about something, maybe you should talk to Vanessa directly, not about Cameron's personal business, but about whatever's making you feel uneasy. Sometimes, the direct approach is the best approach. I almost laughed. I tried that yesterday. She got defensive and basically shut down the conversation. Well, maybe she needs time to process whatever you discussed. Vanessa's never liked feeling cornered, even when we were children. Give her a few days, then try again. After Mom left, I found myself pacing around the apartment, too restless to focus on any of the tasks I'd planned for the day. The baby was active, responding to my agitated energy with a series of kicks and movements that reminded me I wasn't the only one affected by my stress levels. I needed to do something constructive, something that would either provide answers or help me let go of my suspicions. An idea occurred to me that felt both reasonable and slightly devious. I could visit Cameron's workplace. Vanessa had mentioned that Cameron worked for a small tech startup that developed restaurant apps. While she'd been vague about the company's name and location, I remembered her once mentioning that it was in southeast Portland, somewhere near the industrial district. A little online research might help me narrow down the possibilities. I spent the next hour searching for Portland-based tech companies that specialized in restaurant technology. The results were more extensive than I'd expected, but I was able to identify 5 companies that seemed to match Vanessa's general description. 3 of them had websites that included staff directories or team photos. The first company's website showed a team of 12 people, none of whom looked like Cameron. The second company had a more extensive staff listing, and I carefully examined every photo and name, looking for any version of Cameron Walsh or anyone who resembled him. Nothing. The third company's website was more professionally designed, with polished headshots of their development team. I scrolled through the faces methodically, and then I saw him. The photo showed a person with Cameron's general facial structure and build, but there were subtle differences. The hair was styled differently, and the person in the photo appeared slightly younger, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The name listed under the photo was Chris Anderson, senior developer. Chris Anderson, not Cameron Walsh. I stared at the screen for several minutes, my heart racing. This could be a coincidence, just someone who happened to resemble my brother-in-law. But the similarities were too strong to ignore, especially considering all the other inconsistencies I'd been noticing. The company was called TechPlate Solutions, and their office was located in an industrial building on Division Street. According to their website, they specialized in point-of-sale systems and customer management apps for restaurants and food service businesses. It was exactly the kind of work Vanessa had described when talking about Cameron's job. I spent another hour researching Chris Anderson online, using the name I'd found on the company website. Unlike Cameron Walsh, Chris Anderson had a more substantial digital footprint. There were LinkedIn profiles, some mentions in local tech newsletters, even a few photos from company events and professional conferences. But all of the online activity for Chris Anderson seemed to stop abruptly about 2 years ago. The LinkedIn profile hadn't been updated in 18 months. The last mention in any tech publication was from early the previous year. It was as if Chris Anderson had simply vanished from the professional world at exactly the time when Cameron Walsh had appeared in Vanessa's life. The implications were staggering. If Cameron Walsh and Chris Anderson were the same person, it would explain the gaps in Cameron's online presence, the lack of long-term friends and family connections, and the secretive behavior I'd been observing. It would also suggest that Cameron had been living under a different identity, possibly as part of a gender transition. But it still didn't explain why any of this would lead to sabotaging my gender reveal party. I was so absorbed in my research that I didn't notice Derek's key in the front door until he was standing in the living room, looking at me with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Please tell me you're not still investigating your sister's marriage," he said, noting my laptop and the scattered papers around me. I closed the laptop quickly, feeling caught in the act of something I couldn't quite defend. I was just doing some general research. Derek sat down heavily in the armchair across from me. "Natalie, we need to talk. This obsession with Cameron and Vanessa is getting out of hand. You're not sleeping well, you're stressed all the time, and now you're spending your days conducting surveillance on family members." "It's not surveillance," I protested. "It's just trying to understand some things that don't make sense." "Even if there are things that don't make sense, why is it your job to figure them out? Why can't you just accept that people are entitled to their privacy?" Derek's questions were reasonable, but they missed the fundamental issue that was driving my investigation. Because something about all of this feels connected to what happened at our party. I can't shake the feeling that we were deliberately targeted. Targeted? Derek's voice rose with exasperation. "Natalie, listen to yourself. You're talking like we're victims of some conspiracy." A fire alarm went off at a public park. It was bad timing, but it wasn't a personal attack. I wanted to share everything I'd discovered. The timing of Vanessa's movements before the alarm, her dry appearance afterward, the argument she'd had with Cameron in the parking lot, the discrepancies in Cameron's identity, the possibility that he was transgender and living under an assumed name. But I could see in Derek's expression that he'd already reached his limit with my theories. "Maybe you're right," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Maybe I'm reading too much into everything." Derek's expression softened slightly. "I'm worried about you, and I'm worried about the baby. This level of stress and suspicion isn't healthy for either of you. Can you please promise me that you'll let this go?" I nodded, knowing that I was lying again. But I also knew that continuing this investigation alone was becoming increasingly difficult. I needed help from someone who wouldn't dismiss my concerns as pregnancy-induced paranoia. After Derek went to bed that night, I made a decision. I was going to call Zoe and ask if she'd be willing to help me with some discreet investigation. Zoe had always been good at reading people and situations, and as a freelance photographer, she was used to observing details that others might miss. "I need a favor," I said when Zoe answered her phone, "and I need you to keep it between us." "This sounds ominous," Zoe said, but her tone was intrigued rather than concerned. "What kind of favor?" I explained my suspicions about Cameron's identity and the possibility that he was living under an assumed name. I shared the information I'd found about Chris Anderson and asked if Zoe would be willing to visit TechPlate Solutions with me to see if we could confirm whether Cameron and Chris were the same person. "So you think your brother-in-law is transgender and possibly using a different name professionally?" Zoe summarized when I finished explaining. "Yes, but there's more to it than that. I think whatever's going on with his identity might be connected to what happened at our party." Zoe was quiet for a moment. "Okay, I'll help you," she said finally. "But not because I think there's some grand conspiracy. I'll help because you're my friend, and if this is what it takes for you to put your mind at rest, then let's get some definitive answers." We arranged to meet the next morning at a coffee shop near TechPlate Solutions. The plan was simple. We'd visit the company under the pretense of Zoe being a potential client interested in their restaurant technology services. During the meeting, we'd hopefully be able to confirm whether the Chris Anderson from their website was actually Cameron Walsh. That night, I dreamed about alarms and identities and secrets hiding behind familiar faces. When I woke up, I realized that tomorrow would either validate all of my suspicions or force me to confront the possibility that I'd been wrong about everything. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical October weather in Portland. I met Zoe at a small cafe on Division Street, just a few blocks from TechPlate Solutions' office. She dressed professionally for our reconnaissance mission, wearing a black blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that made her look like a serious business client. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Zoe asked as we walked toward the building that housed TechPlate Solutions. "Once we know for certain, there's no one knowing it." "I'm sure," I said, though my heart was racing with nervousness. I need to know the truth. TechPlate Solutions occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse building. The lobby was modern and minimalist, with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting. A receptionist directed us to a small conference room where we were told someone would meet with us shortly to discuss their services. The someone turned out to be a woman named Sarah Chen, who introduced herself as the company's business development manager. She was friendly and professional, clearly experienced at presenting their technology solutions to potential clients. "We'd love to set up a demo of our point-of-sale system," Sarah said after Zoe had explained her fictional restaurant's needs. "Let me see if Chris is available to show you some of the technical features. He's our senior developer and really knows the system inside and out." My pulse quickened. "That would be great," Zoe said smoothly. Sarah stepped out of the conference room to find Chris, and I used the opportunity to look around. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see into the main office space where several people were working at computers. I scanned the faces, looking for anyone who resembled Cameron. "Chris should be here in just a minute," Sarah said, returning to the conference room. He was just finishing up a client call. And then the door opened, and Chris Anderson walked in. It was definitely Cameron. Same facial structure, same build, same mannerisms, but there were subtle differences that would have been easy to miss if I hadn't been looking for them. His hair was cut shorter and styled differently. He was wearing glasses that Cameron never wore. His clothing was more formally professional than Cameron's typical casual style. But it was unmistakably the same person. "Hi there," he said, extending his hand to Zoe with a warm smile. "I'm Chris Anderson. Sarah tells me you're interested in learning about our restaurant management solutions." His voice was the same voice I'd heard at family dinners and gatherings, though his demeanor seemed more confident and outgoing than Cameron's typically reserved personality. It was as if he was more comfortable in this professional identity than in his personal one. Zoe handled the interaction perfectly, asking intelligent questions about the technology while I sat quietly and observed. Chris was knowledgeable and enthusiastic about the company's products, clearly passionate about his work in a way that seemed genuine. As the demo progressed, I found myself studying Chris's body language and speech patterns, comparing them to my memories of Cameron. The similarities were undeniable, but so were the differences. Chris seemed more animated, more confident, more fully present than Cameron ever appeared to be at family gatherings. After about 30 minutes, Zoe wrapped up the meeting by saying she'd need to discuss the information with her business partners before making any decisions. Chris gave her his business card and encouraged her to call if she had any additional questions. "Thanks so much for your time," Zoe said as we prepared to leave. "This has been really helpful." "Absolutely," Chris replied. "And congratulations, by the way," he added, looking at me with a friendly smile. "When are you due?" The casual question caught me off guard. "January," I managed to say. "That's exciting. First baby?" I nodded, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the casual conversation. Here was Cameron, or Chris, or whoever he really was, making small talk about my pregnancy, while living what appeared to be a completely double life. As we left the building, Zoe and I walked in silence for several blocks before either of us spoke. "Well," Zoe said finally, "that was definitely the same person. You saw it too?" "Oh yeah, same facial structure, same voice, same mannerisms. But it was like seeing two different personalities occupying the same body." We found a quiet spot in a nearby park where we could talk without being overheard. The morning drizzle had stopped, but the benches were still damp, so we stood under a large oak tree whose remaining leaves provided some shelter. So Cameron is living under two different identities, I said, trying to process the implications. Chris Anderson at work, Cameron Walsh in his personal life. It looks that way, Zoe agreed. But the question is why? And more importantly, how does this connect to your gender reveal party? That was the piece I still couldn't figure out. Even if Cameron was transgender and using different names in different contexts, even if there were complex identity issues involved, I couldn't understand how any of that would lead to sabotaging my party. Maybe it doesn't, I admitted. Maybe the fire alarm really was just a coincidence, and I've been chasing a connection that doesn't exist. But, even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Too many things had aligned too perfectly for it to be random chance. There was still something I was missing. Some crucial piece of information that would make everything make sense. What are you going to do now? Zoe asked. I thought about Derek's concerns about my stress levels, about my promise to let this investigation go, about the anatomy scan appointment we had scheduled for that afternoon. I thought about Vanessa's defensive behavior and the way she'd called our mother to express concern about my mental state. I'm going to confront them, I said. Both of them, together. I'm going to tell them what I know and demand some honest answers. Zoe looked concerned. Are you sure that's a good idea? This seems like really personal stuff, and you might be opening a can of worms that affects more than just you. She was probably right, but I'd come too far to back down now. I can't let this go, I said. Not until I understand what really happened at my party and why. That afternoon, Derek and I had our 20-week anatomy scan appointment. As we sat in the waiting room of Dr. Martinez's office, I tried to focus on the excitement of seeing our baby and learning the gender that had been hidden in yesterday's ruined cake. But my mind kept drifting to Chris Anderson and Cameron Walsh and the conversation I was planning to have with Vanessa. You seem distracted, Derek observed, taking my hand. Everything okay? Just nervous about the scan, I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. When our names were called, we followed the ultrasound technician into a dimly lit room filled with sophisticated medical equipment. As I lay on the examination table with gel spread across my growing belly, I felt the baby respond to the pressure of the ultrasound wand with a series of kicks and movements. There's your little one, the technician said, pointing to the grainy image on the monitor. Everything looks great so far. Good size, strong heartbeat, all the organs developing right on schedule. Derek squeezed my hand as we watched our baby move around on the screen. Despite everything else that was occupying my mind, this moment felt magical and profound. And, the technician said with a smile, would you like to know if you're having a boy or a girl? Derek and I looked at each other and nodded simultaneously. Congratulations, she said. You're having a daughter. A daughter. The word sent a warm rush of emotion through my chest. I pictured tea parties and bedtime stories, teaching her to be strong and independent, watching her grow into her own person. But even in that moment of pure joy, I couldn't completely push away the questions that had been consuming me. Our daughter would grow up in a family with secrets and hidden identities, with an aunt and uncle whose relationship was built on foundations I didn't understand. I wanted better for her. I wanted honesty and authenticity and relationships based on truth rather than carefully constructed facades. As we left the doctor's office with printouts of our daughter's ultrasound images, I made a final decision about my investigation. Tonight, I was going to get the answers I needed, no matter what it cost me. That evening, I called Vanessa and asked if Derek and I could come over for dinner. My voice was steady, casual, giving no hint of the storm that was about to break over all of us. Of course, Vanessa said, sounding genuinely pleased. I'll make that pasta dish you love. How did your doctor's appointment go? Did you find out the gender? We did, I said. We'll tell you all about it when we see you. Derek wasn't thrilled about the dinner invitation, especially when I admitted that I had ulterior motives for the visit. But when I told him about finding Chris Anderson at TechPlate Solutions, when I showed him the business card and explained the undeniable physical similarities, his skepticism began to crack. Even if you're right about the identity thing, he said as we drove to Vanessa's house, you need to be careful how you handle this. If Cameron is transgender and hasn't told his family, There might be very good reasons for that privacy. I know, I said. I'm not trying to out anyone or violate their privacy. I just want to understand what happened at our party and why. We arrived at Vanessa and Cameron's house, just as the sun was setting, painting their yellow bungalow in warm golden tones. The smell of garlic and herbs drifted from the kitchen, and I could hear jazz music playing softly from their living room speakers. Vanessa answered the door wearing an apron over her jeans, flour dusting her hands. She looked relaxed and happy, the picture of domestic contentment. Perfect timing, she said, hugging us both. Dinner's almost ready. Cameron emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the slightly awkward smile he always seemed to have around Derek and me. Hey guys, good to see you. As we settled in their living room with drinks, the conversation flowed easily at first. Vanessa asked about the ultrasound appointment, and Derek proudly showed them the printout images of our daughter. A girl! Vanessa exclaimed, studying the grainy black and white photos. Oh, she's going to be beautiful. Have you thought about names yet? We're still discussing options, Derek said, but we're both excited. Cameron looked at the ultrasound images with what seemed like genuine interest. That's amazing that they can see so much detail now. Technology is incredible. It was such a normal family conversation that I almost lost my nerve. These were people who loved me, who were excited about my pregnancy, who had welcomed me into their home for a pleasant evening. What right did I have to shatter that peace with accusations and demands for truth? But then I remembered the fire alarm, the chaos, the ruined cake that should have revealed this exact news in front of all our friends and family. I remembered Vanessa's dry dress and her perfectly timed social media post. I remembered all the small deceptions and inconsistencies that had led me to this moment. As we moved to the dinner table, I waited for the right opportunity to shift the conversation. It came when Vanessa started talking about work, mentioning a freelance graphic design project she was completing for a local restaurant. Speaking of restaurants, I said carefully, Cameron, didn't you say you work with restaurant technology, point-of-sale systems and things like that? Cameron paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Yeah, that's right. Why do you ask? Just curious about the industry. My friend Zoe is thinking about opening a restaurant, and she's been researching different technology solutions. I kept my voice light, conversational. She mentioned visiting a company called Tech Plate Solutions. Do you know them? The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Cameron's face went pale, and Vanessa's hand tightened around her wine glass. They exchanged a quick glance that confirmed everything I suspected. I'm not familiar with that company, Cameron said, but his voice lacked conviction. Really? I continued, reaching into my purse to pull out the business card Zoe had been given. That's interesting, because my friend met with someone there named Chris Anderson, who seemed very knowledgeable about the field. I placed the business card on the table between us, and the silence that followed was deafening. Cameron stared at the card as if it were a loaded weapon, while Vanessa's face cycled through a range of emotions: surprise, fear, anger, and finally, resignation. Natalie, Vanessa said quietly, what are you doing? I'm trying to understand why my sister's husband is living under two different identities, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. And I'm trying to understand what any of this has to do with the fire alarm that ruined our gender reveal party. Derek shifted uncomfortably beside me. This was his first time seeing the evidence I'd been gathering, and I could sense his growing realization that my theories weren't as far-fetched as he believed. Cameron looked at Vanessa, and something passed between them. Then he sighed deeply and pushed his plate away. My name is Christina Anderson, he said quietly. I'm transgender. I've been transitioning for 3 years, and Cameron Walsh is the identity I use in my personal life, while I navigate the legal and social aspects of that transition. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Derek's eyebrows rose, but he didn't look shocked, exactly. More like he was processing information that explained a lot of smaller observations he'd never quite articulated. Thank you for telling us, I said, but that still doesn't explain the fire alarm. Vanessa and Cameron exchanged another look, and I could see them having a silent conversation about how much to reveal. The fire alarm was an accident, Vanessa said finally. But not the kind of accident you think. What kind of accident was it? Cameron ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make many times during family gatherings when he seemed uncomfortable or stressed. Your gender reveal party was triggering for me, he said. The whole concept of celebrating a baby's assigned gender, of making such a big deal about whether someone is born with male or female anatomy. It brought up a lot of difficult feelings about my own experience. I felt a flash of guilt. I never meant to make you uncomfortable. If we'd known. You couldn't have known, Cameron said, and that's not your fault. But as the ceremony was starting, as I watched everyone gathering around to celebrate finding out whether your baby was a boy or a girl, I had what I guess you'd call a panic attack. Vanessa reached over and took Cameron's hand. He needed air, needed to get away from the crowd for a few minutes. We walked toward the edge of the pavilion, and I was trying to help him calm down. But then someone asked us what was wrong, Cameron continued. One of your coworkers noticed that I looked upset and came over to see if we needed help. I panicked even more, worried that people would start asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. So you pulled the fire alarm? Derek asked, his voice carefully neutral. I leaned against the wall to steady myself, Cameron said. I didn't realize there was an emergency pull station right there. When I put my hand out to brace myself, I accidentally hit the lever. The alarm went off immediately. Vanessa picked up the story. We both knew it was going to cause chaos, but by then it was too late to stop it. And honestly, part of me was relieved, because it meant Cameron didn't have to explain why he was having a panic attack at a gender reveal party. I stared at them both, trying to process this explanation. So it really was an accident. Yes and no, Vanessa said. The alarm itself was accidental, but our reaction afterward wasn't. We should have immediately told someone what happened, should have found you and Derek, and explained. Instead, we let everyone think it was some random malfunction or prank. Why? I asked. Because explaining would have meant revealing Cameron's identity issues, and we weren't ready for that conversation with the family, Vanessa said. We've been trying to figure out the right time and way to share that information. Cameron nodded. I've been dreading family gatherings for months, knowing that eventually someone would ask the right questions or notice the inconsistencies in my background. When the alarm went off, it felt like a reprieve, even though I felt terrible about ruining your special day. I thought about the video footage of Vanessa moving toward the east side of the pavilion, about her dry appearance afterward, about the argument Zoe's boyfriend had witnessed in the parking lot. But you weren't caught in the sprinklers, I said to Vanessa. And Tyler saw you two arguing in the parking lot afterward. Vanessa sighed. When Cameron accidentally triggered the alarm, I immediately realized what had happened. I managed to pull him away from the area before the sprinklers activated, which is why we stayed relatively dry. And yes, we were arguing in the parking lot. About what? About whether to tell you the truth right then, Cameron said. Vanessa wanted to find you immediately and explain what had happened. I was terrified that it would lead to conversations about my transition that I wasn't ready to have with your family. So we compromised, Vanessa continued. We decided to wait and see if anyone suspected that the alarm wasn't random. If no one asked questions, we'd just let it be assumed that it was an accident or malfunction. If people started investigating, we'd tell the truth. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that my instincts had been correct about the alarm not being random, guilt about the way my investigation had pressured them into revelations they weren't ready to make, and sadness about the fear and discomfort Cameron had been experiencing at family gatherings. I'm sorry, I said to Cameron. I'm sorry that our party was triggering for you, and I'm sorry that my investigation put you in a position where you felt forced to share personal information. And I'm sorry we didn't tell you the truth immediately, Vanessa said. We should have trusted that you'd be understanding about Cameron's situation. Derek had been quiet through most of this conversation, but now he leaned forward slightly. Can I ask about the identity situation? I'm trying to understand the practical aspects. Cameron looked relieved to shift to more logistical questions. I started transitioning 3 years ago, but the legal name change process is complicated and expensive. I've been using Christina professionally because that's the name on my official documents. But socially, I've been living as Cameron while I save money for legal fees and navigate the bureaucracy. It's been stressful keeping track of which identity to use in which situations, Vanessa added. And we've been worried about family reactions, especially since we got married so quickly after meeting. We didn't want people to think our relationship was some kind of experiment or phase. I thought about all the small observations that had seemed suspicious. Cameron's quietness at family gatherings, the lack of childhood friends at their wedding, the sparse social media presence, the secretive medical appointments. Everything makes sense now, I said. All the things that seemed odd or inconsistent. You were just trying to manage a complicated situation while protecting your privacy. Exactly, Cameron said. And honestly, it's been exhausting. Having to monitor every conversation, every story about my past, making sure I don't contradict myself or reveal information I'm not ready to share. Why didn't you trust us with the truth earlier? Derek asked. Vanessa and Cameron looked at each other, and I could see them weighing how honest to be. Because we weren't sure how the family would react, Vanessa said finally. You and Natalie have always been accepting people, but talking about being transgender is different from talking about other issues. We wanted to be sure of our relationship, sure of Cameron's transition path, before opening that conversation. Plus, Cameron added, I was still figuring out my own identity. 3 years ago, I barely understood what being transgender meant for me personally. I wasn't ready to educate other people about it when I was still learning myself. We talked for another hour, with Cameron and Vanessa sharing more details about their relationship and Cameron's transition journey. I learned that they'd met at a support group for LGBTQ+ individuals, that Vanessa had been volunteering there as part of her graphic design work for nonprofit organizations. So your whole relationship started in the context of understanding identity issues, I said. Yes. Vanessa nodded. Which made it easier for me to support Cameron through the transition, but also made us both more protective of that privacy when it came to family. As the evening wound down, I found myself feeling emotionally drained, but also oddly relieved. The mystery that had been consuming me for days finally had an explanation that made sense. There had been deception, but not malicious deception. There had been a deliberate act that affected my party, but not a vindictive one. What happens now? I asked as Derek and I prepared to leave. We'd like to start being more open with the family, Cameron said. Starting with you two. It would be nice not to have to monitor every conversation or worry about slip-ups. And we'll help you understand whatever you need to know about transgender issues, Vanessa added. I know it might be a learning curve for everyone. As Derek and I drove home, we talked through everything we'd learned. Derek admitted that my investigative instincts had been more accurate than he'd given me credit for, while I acknowledged that my methods had probably been more invasive than necessary. I'm glad we know the truth, Derek said, but I feel bad that Cameron was so uncomfortable at family gatherings without any of us realizing it. Maybe we can do better going forward, I said. Be more aware of how our celebrations and traditions might affect people who don't fit conventional expectations. Like making sure our daughter grows up understanding that gender is more complicated than just pink or blue, Derek said. I smiled, thinking about our future daughter and the kind of family she'd grow up in. A family that included an aunt and uncle, whose relationship had taught them both about love, acceptance, and the courage to be authentic. A family that had learned to navigate difficult conversations and support each other through challenging revelations. The mystery of the ruined gender reveal party was solved, but more importantly, our family had grown stronger and more honest. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't about solving puzzles, but about learning to ask better questions and listen more carefully to the answers. Our daughter would be born into a family that understood the difference between secrets kept out of fear and privacy maintained out of love. She'd learn that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it's complicated. And she'd grow up knowing that gender reveals are just the beginning of discovering who someone really is. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.